All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody who's logging on right now, and thank you for joining us for this live webinar, which we've titled, What Says the Great Physician? Moral Reflection, Medical Ethics, and Cultural Narratives. First and foremost, I hope all of you and your families and loved ones are doing well during this challenging time. I took a peek at the registration earlier and saw that we have folks logging on from all over North Carolina and really all over the country. So wherever you're coming in from tonight, welcome. And it's great to have this platform where we can kind of virtually be together, even if not in the presence of one another. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all of our medical professionals of various sorts who are participating tonight. For any of you who are serving on the front lines in the healthcare system right now, thank you for your service, your sacrifice. We realize that this is a really tough time and setting, and you guys are doing amazing work. So thank you, especially to all of you, and thanks for being with us tonight. I hope this is a blessing to you. My name is Matt Hain, and I'm on staff with an organization called the North Carolina Study Center. We are a center for hospitality and Christian education at UNC Chapel Hill. For those of y'all who know UNC's campus, we're located just adjacent to campus, to North Campus, right off Battle Lane at the historic Battle House. We run a hospitality ministry as a home away from home for students, and also Christian educational programming, reading groups, seminars, our fellows program, regular events with Christian faculty. And so it's a gift to get to put together events like this and to share them and co-host them with others. I'd like to thank some of my colleagues who helped tonight to put this together, especially Andrew Borer, who is a part of the TMC program that we're going to hear about tonight. Also Carrie West and Mary Rachel Bulkley, among others. Thank you for all those who played a role putting this together. And thank you also to our numerous co-sponsors tonight. First and foremost, the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke Divinity School, which Farr and Patrick are both in the leadership of. This is a wonderful program. You'll hear more about it tonight. We would like to thank them, and it's an honor and privilege to co-sponsor alongside you. Also would like to thank the Arete Initiative at the Duke Keenan Institute for Ethics, Triangle Christian Medical and Dental Association, InterVarsity Grad and Faculty Ministries at UNC, and also, last but not least, the Bradley Study Center at Virginia Tech, one of our partner study centers who is participating tonight. So welcome to all of our friends in Blacksburg. I'd also like to welcome my fellow moderator for tonight, Delaney Thole. Delaney, welcome Delaney. Delaney is a friend of mine and also a first-year PhD student at UNC. She is studying ethics and moral philosophy, so she is more of an expert on this topic than I. And she is originally from Mobile, Alabama, where she's coming to us live from tonight. And a fun fact I found out tonight, Delaney, preparing for this, April 6th through 10th was supposed to be Graduate and Professional Student Appreciation Week at UNC. So we can't show you our appreciation in person, but still, Delaney, we appreciate you and welcome tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's so great that grad students are always included in the life of the Study Center, so it means a lot.
Oh yeah, absolutely. First off, how are you doing? How are things for you and your family down in Alabama?
We're well. I'm missing friends in Chapel Hill. I'm missing the life of the philosophy department at Carolina. I'm kind of getting my head around what it means to do research from home, like I think grad students all across the country are sort of adjusting to. I certainly didn't expect to move home with my parents in my mid-20s, but at the same time, I feel extremely glad for the time with family. So it's good.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for taking the time to be with us tonight. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two guests for the evening, Dr. Farr Curlin and Dr. Patrick Smith. Dr. Curlin, I'm going to give kind of abbreviated biographies here for the sake of time so we can jump in. But Dr. Curlin is a hospice and palliative care physician at Duke, where he holds joint appointments in the School of Medicine, including its Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine, and in Duke Divinity School, including the initiative in Theology, Medicine, and Culture, which I shared with you. As an ethicist, he addresses questions regarding whether and in what ways physicians' religious commitments ought to shape their clinical practices in a plural democracy. His areas of expertise are medicine, medical ethics, doctor-patient relationships, religion and medicine, and also conscience. Conscience. Perhaps most importantly of all, Farr is a double graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, both BA and MD. So he's on loan at Duke, but he's really a Tar Heel at heart.
That's right.
Yes. And our second speaker tonight, Dr. Patrick Smith, is associate faculty with the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine at Duke. He has specific academic interests in the areas of bioethics, social ethics, Black church studies, and philosophical theology. Before coming to Duke, Professor Smith held academic appointments as an associate professor of philosophical theology and ethics at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, and also as lecturer at Harvard Medical School through the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. He was core faculty for the Master of Bioethics degree program offered through Harvard's Center for Bioethics. So Dr. Curlin and Dr. Smith, welcome and thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Having us.
Wonderful. Well, there are really three questions, or three kind of subsets of questions that are embedded within the title that we've chosen for tonight: medical ethics, moral reflection, and cultural narratives. And by cultural narratives, we mean kind of what's the meaning in all of this, in this ordeal we're going through with coronavirus. What's the significance or the sense of meaning as part of it? So I think tonight we'll kind of take those one at a time. This will be kind of like the nesting dolls, but in reverse. So we'll start fairly narrow or small with medical ethics and some particulars, and then we'll kind of gradually expand outward to the broader moral questions. And then finally, to kind of what's our meta question for tonight, this question of meaning and significance. How do we kind of wrap our minds around our moment? Time permitting, there will be some Q&A at the end. So I invite all those who are live with us tonight to submit your questions throughout the discussion, and we'll do our best to have some time for Q&A at the end.
Awesome.
All right.
Should we go ahead and jump in? I think we can start with a question that's been pressing on everyone's minds. It's been awesome to see so many ethics conversations happening all across the country, on the news, on social media, around my own family's kitchen table. And a lot of it centers around this question of resource scarcity. So we've been hearing these reports about we're lacking ventilators, and hospitals are facing the prospect of not being able to support every patient experiencing respiratory failure. And doctors are having to make these really difficult decisions about who should receive care. Is it the first patients to get sick? Is it the youngest? Is it the ones who have the best chance for survival? Both of you are bioethicists. You're both also Christians. Can you think with us about how Christians might think about resource allocation during times of scarcity?
Delaney, I'll take a stab at that. I have been struck that, as you said, this has generated intense public and professional dialogue and debate. I'm a part of a national listserv on medical ethics, and I think there have been more postings in the last 2 weeks than there have been the entire year or 12 months prior to that. There is intense interest in this, and I think one of the things that strikes me is that this is not an area where the lines are clearly drawn. Where we have ongoing disputes about something like euthanasia or abortion. This is something people are really struggling to get their heads around, and that includes Christians. What can Christians say about this? We can say that certainly for Christians, our first language is not the language of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is kind of the notion that you want to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. And it, in our world, that's so driven by economic forces and by a general ethic that tends to rank people based on their utility and their capacity for production, their ability to generate goods and services. Utilitarianism can become a kind of crass way of weighing people up as if they can all be exchanged into some kind of denominator like money. That's not the way Christians think. So our approach should not, I think, be utilitarian. It's also not too focused on autonomy. I think one of the things that's been striking in this moment is that we've seen that the autonomy-based ethic that has become so dominant for much of clinical care in the advanced North Atlantic countries, let's say, where our focus is on trying to help people bring about the life that they imagine for themselves using the technologies available for us. That goes out the window. Everybody can see now that just doesn't work when we have a lot of people sick and not enough medical resources to go around. But a focus on autonomy in that way was never really, never fit well, I think, with Christians. Christians are called to respond to those in need who are in front of us. those who are our neighbors, those who are within our sphere of influence. And we're to be, I think, another thing we can say is that Christians are to be loving and generous, characterized by that. I was struck by the story of the priest in Italy, the elderly priest who, at a time when the ventilators were in short supply and he was beginning to die of respiratory failure from COVID, refused the ventilator so that it would be available for others. Is that a decision every Christian has to make? No. But it seems like the kind of decision that resonates with who we're called to be as Christians, those who are not grasping for ourselves, but instead looking to share what we have with those who need it. Our Christian approach, I think, also clearly emphasizes from the scriptures through the history of the church, a solidarity with those who are on the margins, those who tend to be overlooked, those who are in some category of people that's maybe not as politically or socially powerful. So I think we have to have a particular eye to not have a system set up that somehow privileges those who are already in power, those who have the most freedom already, or that is prejudiced toward, even implicitly or unwittingly, toward those with disabilities, those who are weaker in some way in their capacities, less productive economically, and so on. We would want to have solidarity with those who are sick, whatever their characteristics. And I think the net of that is that, and there's more to be said, this is not to resolve the questions, but Christians are able to triage medical resources. And there are different ways to go about that, but a general approach that focuses on using the resources available, prioritizing them for those who are most likely to benefit from them, where the benefit is a direct one of preserving and restoring their health in the short term, in the visible future, because so much is uncertain. That kind of prioritization makes sense. And the last thing I'll say there, Patrick and I talked about this earlier, is that there will be tragedy in these choices. They will be tragic. And that's a category. The category of the tragic is something we often ignore, but we are faced with it in a moment like this. And that is that we will not, those of us on the front lines, those who have to make hard decisions, including those making policies, will not be able to make choices that are morally pristine in such a way that they don't have to grieve the harms that are going to come about as a result of their choices and the people who are going to suffer as a result of their choices. It's going to be difficult. And I think in that context, Christians, we hope, are going to be characterized by patience with themselves, with their colleagues who are struggling to do their best, and including patience with those in authority who are trying to make the best decisions they can with a great deal of uncertainty.
And, my dad, who was a pastor for a number of decades, would often, when someone says something that was, very straightforward, very profound, and covered all the bases, ditto, ditto, ditto. And so I say ditto, ditto, ditto with respect to what Farr has laid out for us, and just underscore just two quick points. One is this issue of, as Farr mentioned, about how particular patients' bodies present, right? And we do know there's increasing data and conversation around questions of implicit bias, right, and how that plays out. So I do think for those who are Christians and other folks of just goodwill who are thinking about policy, to just making sure that whatever way they're framing this, that it incorporates human beings as such, and that especially Christian healthcare professionals, that we be very aware of the brokenness in our own lives, our ability to know that our judgments can be clouded, and just be aware that oftentimes these kinds of biases may be at work, and to try to counterbalance those, right? Because we do have those kinds of, quick judgments, but we also have to work against to mitigate those. And also the second point I just want to underscore that Farr raised very beautifully is this idea of the tragic. Some people talk about with whatever decisions you make in these kinds of situations, that there will be some type of moral residue that's left, right? That's just the problems that we have, because we're dealing with competing goods, competing values, If we could have it, where it is nice, clean, crisp, and pristine, we wouldn't be wrestling with these issues in the way that we are having to wrestle with them. And so I think just kind of preparing ourselves for the fact that there will be this more residue that is left, and to be able to acknowledge that and to lament that fact as we continue to press forward.
Thank you. Wow, there's a lot there, and gives us a lot to kind of go on for the rest of the conversation. Patrick, you mentioned kind of specifically Christian healthcare professionals there in your response, and I want to hone in on that a little bit. I know both of you are in the leadership for the Theology, Medicine, and Culture program that I mentioned earlier at Duke, which really focuses, as I understand, on the moral and the theological formation of future medical professionals, Christians who are going into the medical vocations. Currently, we mentioned earlier, medical professionals are bearing an incredible burden. They're being asked to put themselves, and in some cases, by extension, their family, at risk in being the front lines of treating coronavirus. They're working around the clock. Some places, there's limited PPE and limited resources they're working with. I think this presents an opportunity for maybe kind of a two-part question. One, how would y'all describe the vocation of being in medicine as a Christian, being a healthcare professional as a Christian? And then secondly, are there any particular aspects of that vocation that you see this coronavirus pandemic particularly kind of drawing out, or opportunities that are there for Christians who are in the healthcare profession?
Yeah, and I say this because, Farr has been involved with the program, one of the founders of Theology, Medicine, and Culture here at Duke, and I consider myself faculty with TMC, but certainly Farr and a few others have really significantly taken the lead in this program. So I think what I would like to do is maybe, Farr, you can start off in answering that question, right, and then I'll chime in, okay?
Thanks, and it gives me a chance to make a little plug. We do, our vocation in TMC is to train theologically those who are committed to engaging suffering, illness, and disability in light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we have a very unusual program, really singular internationally, in that people who have vocations to healthcare can come spend a year or two studying with us at Duke Divinity School to gain a Christian imagination for their work. To be a physician for a Christian, I think, is, there's kind of two things that come together here. One is our vocation remains that we are disciples of Jesus Christ. It is not as if medicine displaces our primary identity, our primary vocation. And our practice of medicine is always ordered under and made sense of in light of the truth of who Christ is for us. All that God is for us in Christ, and all we're called to by him. But the work of attending to the sick has had a pretty special place in the history of the church. Our Lord inaugurates his kingdom, shows the power of his kingdom breaking in primarily through healing the sick. And he was keen to visit the sick, and the sick were keen to be seen by him throughout his earthly ministry. And since then, the church has made visiting the sick, Jesus tells us that when we visit the sick, we visit him. And so there's something really special and sacred about the work. And my experience is that physicians, whether they're Christians or not, when they're caring for sick people, unless they've just become worn out and jaded, and that happens, but by and large, when they're really caring for someone who's sick and they're able to sacrifice something in helping those folks get well and preserving their health, it is its own reward. They are deeply satisfied with that work. A colleague of ours, Matt Frederick, is an ER doc out in Seattle, and he told a gathering of the TMC Fellowship alumni on Zoom last night about his experience working out there and caring for people coming in with COVID, including patients who have died, and some tragic stories. But he said, I find the morale is high among the practitioners. They're ready to go. They're ready to serve. They're ready to take care of the sick. So I think, interestingly, in this moment, there's a chance for people who work in healthcare to recognize that when we get the opportunity to care for the sick, we come alive. And that's telling us something, I think, about our nature being made in God's image, and about what a special privilege that is.
Yeah, I would just build off of that, this notion of the image of God in human beings, right? And think about Christian tradition, biblical emphasis, Gospel of John, right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and that Word was made flesh. And there's something very important about, I think, the way Christian tradition has thought about this notion of the image of God. And when we look at the biblical language, it says that Jesus is the image of God. And there are all these other passages when referring to other human beings as being made according to the image of God, or made in the image of God. And so in that sense, Jesus becomes this kind of paradigmatic understanding of what it means to be human, right? The enfleshed Jesus, the embodied Jesus. And so how bodies present, how we interact with particular people. I think for those who are engaged in the vocation of medicine, who have been gripped by this Christian tradition, it just gives an opportunity for people to encounter Jesus in their patients, right? If we take seriously this theological notion of, the image of God, and what that means when we're serving the sick, we're serving our Lord in particular ways, and these virtues that are able to be cultivated and expressed in these ways of courage, right? Faith. And one of the other things that we can do, I think, through this process is cultivate this notion of compassion, right? What it means to kind of suffer with others. I think Christian tradition, at least those who lean into those resources, who've been shaped and formed by those resources, there's a lot there in the gospel story that informs what it means to suffer with those who are sick and in need of care.
It's beautiful.
Should we jump into some of the moral reflection?
Yeah, let's make that transition, Delaney. So we'll hopefully come back to, if we have time at the end for Q&A with the audience, to come back to some of the specific medical ethical questions. But now that we've unpacked those a little bit, kind of zooming out just a little bit to kind of broader societal level moral reflection that's happening right now. It is fascinating, as you said, Farr, just to see how much kind of soul searching and kind of moral reflection there is taking place in society right now. One of the perhaps most pressing issues there, at least one of the ones that I'm hearing most often, is while we're practicing social distancing, we're trying to flatten the curve, and we're trying not to overwhelm the capacity of our healthcare system. We're kind of all united in that front right now. There increasingly is kind of voices calling for the trade-off costs that come about as a result of this. Specifically, many people are appealing to the economic costs, educational slowdowns that students are facing right now. There have even been some things I've seen posted this week about kind of initial findings on rates of domestic violence and mental health challenges, all these other issues that are kind of tied to the other side of needing to practice social distancing and stay-at-home orders right now. So I'm wondering, in the sense of moral reflection, what ethical tools or frameworks can y'all point us towards that might be helpful for us as Christians in terms of negotiating the tension, if there is a tension, between these two goods, right? The public health on the one hand, and also all the other goods associated with the economy and just kind of human flourishing on the other hand.
Patrick, why don't you take that?
Yeah, it's a big question and an important question. And it, at least for me anyway, if I'm understanding the question correctly here, is pressing us to lean in as to what it means to kind of operationalize a love ethic, right? So if we are, to love our neighbor, right? What does it mean to love neighbor in light of these kinds of situations, right? So can social distancing be an expression of love of neighbor given what we know about, pandemics and how these things are spread? I absolutely think that it can. However, I would want to put it in the framework if we are thinking about this from in terms of biblical resources or theological framework, right? So if we think about the Great Command, so particularly as it is expressed maybe in Luke 10, right? The love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbor as yourself. And then it goes into the parable of the Good Samaritan as a way of kind of showing what this love of God, proper love of neighbor entails. And so what's interesting about that is that I think, apart from the reflection or the parallel of the gospel that parable gives to us, it also, I think, provides some insights for what an embodied embodied ethic looks like, right? And so I think that's the challenge, right? How do we still have an embodied ethic in the midst of social distancing? And so when we think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's an embodied ethic. The Samaritan had eyes, right, to see, and I would probably interject into the text there, and ears to hear maybe the groans of this wounded man who was there on the road to Jericho. So he was close enough that he was able to see the situation that this person was in and to hear. And then the text says that the Samaritan had a heart of compassion, right? Again, a heart that was sensitive to the plight of others, that served as kind of the motivation, if you will, for the act of mercy that would come next. And then he was extended his hands, right? Used whatever resource that he had on his own person to try to tend to those needs. Then he used his feet, right? By taking this wounded person to an inn so that he could continue to get the care that he needed, because he could not provide everything in his own resources. And then there was a promise to say, you know what, you could still be worse off, because if you owed anything after all this is said and done, you don't have any money, your resources have been taken from you, you could be sold into some type of debt slavery, right? So if there's anything that is still owed, I will come back and sell up with you later. And what's interesting about that is that we see the eyes, the ears, the heart, the hands, the feet, and the voice, right, after this embodied action. So the question becomes, what might that look like in light of social distancing? So how can we use our resources, our networks, right, to bring people together, whether it be through technology or to create space for religious folks, spiritual leaders, pastors, chaplains, to be more integral into these systems? Perhaps, Farr, you can say a little bit more, about those kinds of dynamics. So I think for me, right, the way I think about an embodied ethic in light of social distancing is just saying, can we see still? Can we hear? Can we imagine now new ways that we can embody this ethic of Jesus to really love our neighbor? And a lot of times that has to be worked out in particular contexts, right?
That's much better said than I could say it. I'd only highlight this is another place that I've been struck that very committed, smart, learned, conscientious Christians are struggling with this question. And I don't see that anybody has put forward resources that resolve it decisively. I mean, there have been people who've written essays and made arguments that we are essentially being driven too much by fear, and we are setting aside too many of the good dimensions of the life that God has given us because of a fear that's outsized in proportion to the virus itself. And there's a lot of others saying, no, that's not the case. An ethic of love, as Patrick put it, in this moment has a very peculiar kind of expression, which includes keeping our distance physically, hopefully not relationally. I'm just struck by how difficult it is to resolve this. It seems it's another area where we have to have some patience. We know that we're not to be governed in our pattern of life by anxiety. So that can be a question all of us ask daily. Lord, show me when I'm governed by anxiety rather than I'm governed by love for my neighbor and love for you. And I think what Patrick just described, if we kept that in mind, could be a great resource for making choices daily.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you both. Patrick, I really liked that language of eyes to see and ears to hear. And I think this question kind of gets at that in your research. Some of your academic focus has been on Black church studies and on social ethics and questions of the common good. And we're seeing increasing reports of big disparities in health incomes along racial lines. So that's based on data coming out of Michigan, New Jersey, today Milwaukee, New Orleans in the past couple of weeks. Were you surprised to hear of this disparity in health outcomes? And if so, if not, help us to understand why not. What are some of the sort of social structures or inequalities that might be driving those disparities?
Yeah, thanks, Delaney. For that question. To be honest with you, I wasn't very surprised, but it's still very disheartening nevertheless, right? And the reason why I wasn't surprised is just when you think about the existing health disparities that we see that's just kind of prevalent amongst us, you just know it just simply stands to reason, one, but then we also have kind of a historical analyses that we can appeal to, that the existing disparities are exacerbated in the time when you have a pandemic or a crisis or something along that line, especially when you have those who are, as Howard Thurman would say, disinherited and disenfranchised in particular ways. So in that sense, what we see, I think, are the symptoms of, medical professionals on one hand look at the symptoms of how COVID-19 maybe expressed itself in the body. I think with these ongoing disparities that we're seeing with respect to at least what we're thinking that we're seeing, if the data is pushing us in the right direction, are the symptoms of COVID-19 and our body politic. The reality is that when you think about access to healthcare, when you think about the disparities in terms of education, when you think about questions of wealth inequities, when you think about the problems surrounding housing, right? All of these present challenges or barriers, if you will, to accessing healthcare, so that there can be better health outcomes across the board, right? And so there are all these inequalities that we see, and I would want to go so far as to argue, as many others have argued as well, that these inequalities are not just benign, right? That they're not just inequalities, but I think they raise the level of inequities, or some may say disparities, because when you have these inequalities that may be produced in large part, even if not all, but in large part by various forms of injustice, then you have inequities and disparities such that we need to give collective attention to. And when you think about the intergenerational ongoing impact, negative impact of American slavery, of peonage, black codes, Jim Crow, the systematic exclusion of African Americans from the GI Bill that created an instant middle class, right? You have all of these various instances that have been informed by racism, systematic racism to be more precise, that have shaped the way we do life together, right? And we can't just ignore that or turn a blind eye to that. And so because this has been with us in some ways, and that we're still trying to bear witness against, I think Christian tradition screams out to us to say that, hey, things are not supposed to be this way, right? That we need to work towards a vision of shalom with respect to these issues. So in that sense, still disheartening, but I'm not necessarily surprised by it. I think we do need to give concentrated attention to making sure that whatever policies that we're crafting, policies and actions and activities that we want to get behind, would have at its heart a focus on the margins. Because if you're not intentional about it, so easy for those margins to continue to be exacerbated by such a crisis.
Thank you, Patrick. I think my question kind of connects to that in some form. It's always difficult to forecast the future of any sort, especially sociologically, I think. But one thing that I feel like I'm seeing is a newfound appreciation and awareness amongst a lot of folks about how interconnected and interdependent all of us really are. This whole pandemic has posed so many questions of collective action and kind of the collective good, or collective problem solving, where it's not a matter of individualism or kind of American ideals of personal autonomy, but it kind of takes collective action to respond appropriately. Would either of you, are you optimistic that maybe coming out of this, there will be a newfound appreciation for kind of the importance of our interdependence and collectiveness, or not so optimistic about that, acknowledging that that's a hard thing to forecast?
Well, I'm not optimistic, I'd say, but I sure hope that that's true, Matt. I mean, a singular, you know this better than I, but a singular emphasis of the Enlightenment and of modernity has been on the human as sort of basically independent and forming associations with others only when he or she chooses to do so or gives consent to do so. So we don't have any kind of intrinsic obligations to one another in that way of thinking. something like the pandemic just exposes how that way of thinking is not adequate for us. It's not adequate for us when we face, when anything scratches the surface of our apparent independence. We are, in fact, always deeply dependent on each other. We're terribly dependent on the Amazon delivery guy, the people still unloading the garbage, stacking the shelves at the grocery store, people growing vegetables in Guatemala and Mexico and California. So hopefully this will be a moment where we can see that more and maybe be a clue that people will follow, that maybe this whole focus on individual autonomy is starting off on the wrong foot. I'm not optimistic, but hopeful.
Well, hey, ditto, right? I wouldn't use the word optimistic. Optimistic, at least in my way of thinking about it, along with many others, has a kind of inevitability to it, a kind of a natural linear, whatever we mean by, progress and so on and so forth. So I'm not really optimistic. Again, there are so many of these, the kind of tribalism that too often characterizes the way that we do life together now is not so easily set aside, unfortunately. And I think that you can still see the vestiges of that, just popping up even in our contemporary discourse. But I will say, because I am a follower of Christ, that I remain hopeful. I remain deeply hopeful. The fact that God is not dead, and that there's a larger kind of eschatological vision and promises of God that we stand on. So one of the things where I get renewed is in our services, our church services, even though it's virtual at this point, but just hearing our pastor preach and reminding us of the promises of God, and reminding us that the promises of God are stronger than the situation that we find ourselves in right now. So while I'm not optimistic, I'm still hopeful, but that hope has to be infused by the grace of the gospel that empowers us for service, right? So I don't look at it in a situation where we're just going to trust only that God works it out while we sit back, right? We trust that God is going to work it out as we continue to lean in to bear witness, not only in our words, but also in our bodies. And because God is faithful to God's people and to God's world and to God's promises, I still remain hopeful. But it's going to take work. It's going to take a lot of hard work, and it's going to cost us something.
Amen.
Amen.
I think it wouldn't be an official study center event if we didn't have a C.S. Lewis reference, so I'll put one in. I think I and a lot of students have read his essay this week called Learning in Wartime. And he makes a point that seems relevant to the pandemic, though he was writing during the Second World War. He writes that this crisis creates absolutely no situation. It simply aggravates the permanent human situation so that we can no longer ignore it. Human life has always been lived on the edge of a precipice. And I'm curious what aspects of the human condition this virus is uniquely bringing to light, sort of the areas in our life or in our country and our world that are being revealed to us as places that we need to do some work or things that we should take hope in.
Patrick, what do you think?
Well, I mean, one would just be a reiteration of one of the points that I've already made. I do think that when you look at how a crisis like this in particular impacts those on the margins, because certain things were already in place that allows this kind of exacerbation to take to continue to expand in many respects. And so I think for me, that C.S. Lewis quotes kind of connects to that one of the challenges that I think we still have to continue to wrestle with in this country, as much as people don't like to talk about it, right? I mean, obviously, I don't like talking about it. I know people get exhausted with the discourse, but we do have to take seriously systemic racism, how it has shaped the way that we do life together, and try to minimize that long before these crises hit, right? In many ways, I had a friend of mine who was he was in the military. He did ROTC when we were undergraduates, so he was a little bit older than a few of us, but he was very wise beyond his years, and he would always give me this advice. And so for some out there, pardon the military metaphor here, but when he would kind of counsel me on some things, he would just say, he used to call me Pat. He's like, Pat, He said, if you hear and feel the tanks coming down the road, it's probably a little too late to prepare for war at that point, right? And so he was just reminding, he says, look, you got to start thinking about many of these issues earlier, because when the moment hits, you're just not going to be ready. And I think, again, we find ourselves in a situation. So I'll maybe stop there and turn it over to you, Farr, and see what insight you have from C.S. Lewis.
I love me some C.S. Lewis. And I've been thinking about, well, let me say, by the way, if I just blank out, there's a thunderstorm going on right now at where I live, and maybe it's going to knock out my internet. Hopefully not.
Same here as well.
Carry on without me. In a similar way, there's an essay that's been going around of his, a brief letter actually, on living in an atomic age. And people saying, well, how do we go on knowing that the world could be snuffed out? And he says, look, we go on the same way we go on. People went on in the Middle Ages when they knew the plague was coming every year. The way you go on when you lived in Scandinavia and didn't know when the Viking was going to roll up to your village and slit your throat. You go on the way most Christians in the world today, who are in the 2/3 world, go on facing substantial risks of death and disease every year, every month, and with tremendous shortages of medical supplies and no capability of just kind of stocking up and waiting out something like this. But the thing that I think we're exposed with here particularly is the precariousness of human life. It is still an offensive, shocking fact that we're going to die. And I think through all of history, humans tried to avoid that. We all try to avoid that. And the pandemic exposes that we're desperately afraid that that's going to happen to us. And it kind of forces to the front, we are going to die. And we aren't in control. And as Jesus said in Matthew 6, who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? We have very little control over the hour of our death. And that is, it's not a good thing that we're having to face this through a pandemic, but one of the things that we can do in the midst of that is sit and pay attention to the fact that we're going to die and prepare to die daily as we're called to do.
Great insight. Thank you both. I think at this point, so that we can save some time for audience Q&A here at the end, let's transition to kind of our final ultimate question, our broadest question, I guess you could say. And I'm going to frame it in a way that asks you both to weigh in on a debate if you're willing. There was an article that was circulated pretty widely, over the past week or two, that N.T. Wright, the famous New Testament scholar and theologian, published in Time, where he staked out the claim that the Christian calling is not necessarily to try to find meaning or a rationale to explain things like this pandemic or natural disasters. Rather, he said the only fitting Christian response is to lament. We're supposed to lament. We're not supposed to try to find meaning in it. On the same hand, at the same time, and on the counterpoint to this, David Brooks, the famous New York Times columnist, published an article, I think about a day later, titled "The Moral Meaning of the Plague." And it was all about kind of trying to process our moment and to see meaning within it. He argued there that a crisis like this can and should become meaningful when it is connected to what he calls a narrative of redemption. So I'm curious if either of you got a chance to see either of those articles, or just more broadly, your thoughts on this. Should we as Christians seek to find meaning and significance and an explanation in a pandemic like this? If so, how does the Christian story speak to that? And also, what is the place of lament that N.T. Wright mentions at this point? Sorry, Farr, your silence.
No, my apologies. I will say I suspect that David Brooks is going to sound more like N.T. Wright over the years going forward. And I think I'd want to vote with N.T. Wright, with Tom Wright on that. I'm not a theologian, so I'm getting dangerous here, but in studying how the church fathers spoke about illness and disease and health, they were quite keen to be clear that God is not the author of illness. And they were that illness was a result of a fallen world. And they were also keen to be clear that some of God's greatest gifts and most redemptive work seems to happen in the context of illness. And I suspect that David Brooks, what I would hope he's getting at is that in terms of a redemptive story, we have a redemptive story. And that is, we can have confidence that in this moment, not that we can make sense of why God is doing this. That's not a good way for Christians to start thinking. But that in this moment, God is God, and God is active, and God loves God's creatures, and God is going to bring about that good future he has promised, and we can trust him. So we can have the heart of children who are free to love, to delight, to rejoice, to play, to not be too down in the face, because we know that. So we have the lament of what is wrong, and we have the confidence that God is still good, and we don't have to try to make sense of how it all adds up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement. I think it's a mistake, actually, to try to, if one means by looking at this particular crisis, this particular pandemic, to try to give the reason that God would allow this thing to happen at this moment to these people. I think in many ways that's extremely problematic. I think there may be some spiritual dangers that are also associated with such an approach, right? But I do think, right, there is this sense in which, yes, these kinds of things do help us think about meaning in a different sense, right? Or the purpose of life, this side of, yes, I'll be confessional here in this space, this side of kind of new creation, or the new heavens, new earth, whatever, right? I believe in that because I don't think that this is the way the world is supposed to be, and I'm hoping for something much different than this. And so just to echo points that have already been made, think about Romans 8:18, right? The sufferings of this present world aren't worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us, right? It's not that it minimizes the suffering and the tragic experiences that people have, right? And so I think we have to be very careful that we don't kind of glibly say, oh, well, suffering doesn't matter because, God's going to fix everything in the end. Well, for folks who are experiencing the brunt of this, these issues matter, and there are these existential crises, sometimes existential crises of faith that we have to wrestle with. And one of the things that I try to remind myself, as well as others, is that God is big enough to handle our doubts, right? The disorientation that we often feel in these kinds of moments, but we also recognize if we work out the argument there in Romans chapter 8, 8:28, all things work together for good for those who are called, who love God and called according to his purpose, right? So there is a kind of meaning, right, and purpose to all that we experience in this world. So it's pushing us somewhere, but I would certainly push back pretty stringently about trying to identify the reason or the meaning for this particular crisis at this particular moment.
Very, very nuanced and insightful, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been very rich so far. We want to switch with our remaining time to get some of these great questions that have been submitted. I'm going to jump in with one from Matthew Heineman. We'll probably have time for 2 or 3, and then we'll close. So Matthew writes that noting in the context of social distancing, so much of the coronavirus triage is through virtual visits. And he's kind of asking about what it means that so much of our lives have been moved on to technology, certainly in medical interactions, but in many of the other interactions that we have with each other and families and in communities. It's weird to be online and to be plugged into technology all day. What does that mean for Christians who care a lot about in theology this idea of embodiment and being physical creatures?
Patrick.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, right? And in many ways, it's a fundamental challenge, especially as I've talked about a little bit earlier, the importance of, what some will call an incarnational discipleship, an embodied ethic, where Jesus, when he cared for individuals, he healed, he touched, right? Called names, that proximity that is needed. And so I don't think that there are any kind of easy answers to this. I mean, one would hope, as Farr had this phrase a little bit earlier, that we can still remain relationally connected in particular ways. And so it is fascinating that at this moment in the history of our world, we do have some technology. Is it ideal? No, it's not. I do think it comes to a point where if there are individuals in our community that really do have needs, we have to be willing at a particular point when we judge it to be so. And I don't have like hard and fast criteria as to say, okay, when when these criteria are met, then this is when we do this. But I do think at some point, perhaps our local communities could do different kind of buddy systems where, you can be present with people or maybe meet needs to limit the exposure that you would have, obviously, but still being present to people. And that might require putting ourselves in some capacity in harm's way for the sake of the gospel. And, and let me just say kind of one other, piece about this, which is not quite addressing this question, but it's something that I just want to make sure that we name, as well. So we think about those on the front lines, and Farr, actually you did, I'm sorry, allude to this, but, you think about those who work in the grocery stores, those who are delivering packages, also those who are still driving public transportation, right, to get people back and forth to these, various places, and the kind of exposure that they have as well, and the lack of PPE also become extremely important. But let me stop there, and Farr, I don't know if you have any insight to Matthew's question here.
Well, I'm struck that for those of us who have had the gift of having intact families and networks of friends and paychecks so that we're able to hold up. This has been kind of, in a way, a special time. I've connected with my extended family more than I've connected in a long time. But I'm struck that the people that are easily overlooked, the people that we tend not to live next to if we can choose to, the people on the margins are that much harder to see now. And so they're that much more isolated. When we talked to colleagues last night, one of our alums works as a social worker with intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And she noted that this is a particularly hard time for people who are suffering intimate partner violence because they're that much more isolated. Another one of our alums works with the Equal Justice Initiative that seeks prison reform and justice reform of the justice system and the criminal court system. And they, all of the folks who are incarcerated, who are our brothers and sisters, are both at very high risk because they're overcrowded and completely shut out from having anybody visit them. So I'm struck that this digital era is a wonderful gift, and yet, as all things, unevenly distributed, and it kind of makes those disparities and inequities only more heightened. One other thing that comes to my mind about that is that it's just a weird time for Christians. I mean, particularly the church. What does the church do but get together regularly to worship, to take the Lord's Supper? And we're not doing it. We can't do it. And people are coming up with creative efforts to try to overcome that. But it is, and one of the things we lament is, here we are in Holy Week, and we're not going to be with fellow Christians in large groups worshiping this Sunday. That's sad.
And it's a loss, right? I mean, it's a loss. You can feel it.
Yeah.
Thank you both. This next question comes from Alan Zhao. Alan notes that her request, can you speak on the unfortunate reality of more individuals dying alone and how the Christian faith can provide some level of peace in these trying situations? The isolation factor.
This is really, really brutal. Hospitals have, people of goodwill are making these policies. I'm not throwing stones, but there have been a number of hospitals that have said no visitors or only one visitor. One of the outcomes of that is that a lot of people are dying alone. I know of a close friend of a close friend here who is in a local hospital, critically ill, not with COVID, but with something else, and cannot be visited by his wife. This was a sudden, unexpected complication in an ICU, probably not fully conscious, alone. And pastors and priests are not able to come in many cases. This is one area where a colleague, Dan Hall, who's at University of Pittsburgh, has been encouraging thoughtfully shifts in policies that allow for creative ways for clergy to get into the hospital, noting that, look, when we're dying, that should be a time above all others that we see we need one another, and we need our spiritual leaders and ministers. Care of the sick is more than just technology. It involves the ministry of those who are ministers of the gospel. So I'm hopeful that in the coming days, hospitals will loosen that up some and recognize there's going to be some risk involved, but it's the kind of risk that's fitting for us to take for, again, not being unthoughtful about it, but finding ways for the clergy and other people authorized by the church and other religious communities to get into and attend to the faithful.
Thank you both. Oh,
Yeah.
Did you want to jump in?
Say very, very quickly here. Quick little anecdote. Just a couple years ago, my father passed away, and it was interesting in the circumstances in which he died. It was by himself. When my mom encountered my mom and brother, and it was interesting. We were talking with friends of ours a few weeks afterwards, and she was visiting, and we were sitting there, and I said, one of the most frustrating things for me is the fact that I felt like he died alone, right? He died alone, that no one was with him, and I was really lamenting that fact. And she just said, she looked at me right in the face and she said, Patrick, she was like, God is ever present with us. She was like, your dad knew God. And even though you guys would have wanted to be there, your dad did not die alone because God was with him. And it was interesting. Now, again, that's not a substitute to say, therefore, there's not this communal aspect of dying, which we certainly, I think, Alan Verhey's work and the Christian Art of Dying, talks about these communal experiences. That's so important. And I think in the normal course of things, that's kind of a more, Christian idealistic way of really approaching dying and death and so on and so forth. But in those unfortunate moments when that can't be the case, I've just got to have faith, right? That somehow in God's providence, that God can comfort people in ways that we can't. And again, this is not to say, therefore, we don't be present, but in those moments when we can't, I'm just persuaded to just trust God, even if I don't understand how it's all working out.
Amen. That's a helpful way for us to pray for people who are in hospitals right now. We can take one more question, I think. This will be our last audience question. Apologies to everyone that we're not getting to ask. This last one is from Samuel Kimsey. He writes, how do we balance our reaction while trying to both persevere and focus on the tasks in our own lives, as well as grieving and praying for the tremendous death and the need that we see in communities around us?
I'll just say quickly, and then let Farr maybe get the last word here if he wants to. In some ways, I think some of the liturgical practices of the church, if we're attentive to them, kind of build in those processes, right? Farr mentioned just a little while ago that there are many parts of the world who, one could maybe make an argument, kind of live in these situations, right? So they're actually having to develop a robust Christian discipleship with this kind of hovering in an ongoing way. And this becomes the world in which they live, that they have to navigate with these Christian resources. So things, like whether it be, questions of baptism, the conversion, whether it be the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table, right? All of these are rich with theological significance, meaning, and symbolism that reminds us in the present, think back to God's faithfulness of the past, the brokenness of the world, God's redemptive work, and the hope that we have, right? So in some ways, I would just say lean into those liturgical practices that have been with us, those who lean into Christian tradition, and then just apply it to the current moment. So I'll stop there because I know time is short. And I don't know.
Well, that's well said. I think that's one of these, there's no balance I mean, in a way, balance is not a very prominent word for Christians. It's really trust and obey. And does that mean you have immediate access to exactly what that looks like? No, it's why we have to trust and obey. And so I just certainly encourage myself, first of all, but anyone else, to ask the Lord to show you one day at a time where you can respond to Him in reaching out to and loving your neighbor, and trust Him with that. He will guide you along the way, and you're not going to get it right. None of us are, but thankfully He died, as we're celebrating this week. He died on our behalf so that we didn't have to get it right.
Amen.
Exactly. Do either of you want to add any final remarks before we wrap up?
I'll just say to my colleagues out there, the nurses and nursing assistants and physicians and all the people who are working in healthcare, just say I appreciate you, and know that you're sharing in a long stream and a long tradition of the delightful privilege of attending to those who are sick in Jesus' name. And so I just pray God's blessing on you in that task.
And all of those who are out there on the front lines, all of those who are supporting them, my prayer is the prayer that Paul gave to the Ephesians. Pray that out of the glorious riches of God, that He may strengthen us with power through His Spirit in our inner being, so that Christ may dwell in our hearts through faith. And I also pray that we, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how high, how wide, how long and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that we may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God.
Amen.
Amen. Wow. Thank you, Patrick. That's a very fitting way to close. Thank you, everyone, so much for taking the time to tune in tonight. Again, to echo Farr, thank you so much, especially to all of you who are healthcare professionals and all of you who are working on the front lines right now. Our gratitude on behalf of all of us for the work that you're doing. Thank you, especially Patrick and Farr. Thanks for taking the time tonight to be a part of this. Very fruitful discussion. Lots to think about and chew on going forward from here. And we will be sharing the audio online afterwards for those who would like to share with friends or colleagues who maybe couldn't tune in tonight. So Patrick and Farr, thank you very much. And Delaney also, thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, we wish you all the best. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and have a blessed, holy week. Amen.